And we're thinking, God, what are you doing? This was her second ectopic pregnancy. She had had one back in 79 when we were preparing to go overseas. And now a second one in Singapore. And we're just, oh Lord, what is happening? So we go back to Indonesia and just go, okay, that's it for family. There are no kids. Welcome to my home. We're in Colorado. There's a beautiful blue sky, but it's late afternoon and sun's going to be going down. But I want to tell you the story of our two kids, Davin and Denise. And it goes back to the first story I told you. My girlfriend, Sandy, who I married in 1976. We were married for 3-4 years and had not had any kids. And it was an infertility problem. And so in 1980, we had moved to Minnesota. And while we were there, Sandy was doing some nurses training to prepare for Taiwan. And I was working at a church and we were wondering, Lord, why haven't you given us kids? We had dreamt about maybe 4 kids would be perfect. And we didn't have one. And I'm thinking, Lord, what's going on? So we went to see a doctor. And the doctor finally, after many, many visits, the doctor finally figured out that we had a luteal phase defect, something like that. I don't even know what that is to this day. Some hormone imbalance that wasn't working right. So he started working on what would be the options for us? What could we do to resolve the luteal phase defect? And so in 1980, that started. 81 happened. By the end of 81, guess what? We were starting to get pressure. We were supposed to be missionaries overseas in Indonesia. We didn't have our visas to Indonesia. They eventually took 3.5 years to get. We'd been waiting 2 years, and the mission suggested, why don't you go work in Taiwan where you grew up? You already speak the language a little bit. Why don't you work in Taiwan at that hospital that your father-in-law, Frank Dennis, started? And while you're there, just keep learning the language and do work at the hospital. So we did. We moved to Taiwan in the beginning of 81 and started working at Taitung Christian Hospital. I was the maintenance director and Sandy was the nurse in charge of the pediatric ward, trying to train the nurses there how to be better pediatric nurses. They had a new pediatrician from the US who needed nurses that understood pediatrics. And so we spent a year there in Taitung, and everything about having children was on the back burner. There was just nothing we could do about it because this was the tribal area not far from where I grew up in that Amish tribe that I told you about in the first story. So we spent a year there and the mission goes, your visa to Indonesia still has not come. You guys, your Chinese isn't that good. You have childhood Chinese. You should go to language school and study real Chinese. So off we went to Taipei and we joined a language program there in Taipei, left the hospital, and we started studying serious Chinese. 3 hours a day of one-on-one tutoring, or 1-on-2, because we studied together, and 6 hours of prep for 3 hours of tutoring. And so we were 9 hours a day in language study. Let me tell you, the headaches we had every evening. We were so sick of trying to learn another language better. And we did that. But then one day we found out there was a Seventh-day Adventist doctor, Dr. Hayden, who was a specialist in infertility. We'll go, God brought us here to Taiwan. Crazy God stories. Isn't that what I'm talking about? Crazy God stories. He brought us here to Taiwan, and there's an infertility expert right here. So we started going to see Bill Hayden, and he understood the diagnosis of luteal phase defect. And we discovered, he was quite humble, but we discovered that he was actually the one who had invented the remedy for luteal phase defect. And so we worked with him a few months, and he was starting the process on how to deal with the luteal phase defect for Sandy. And we were excited. So we'd been in Taipei doing language study for about 10 months, and I get a phone call from our mission in the US team, and their director of visas, the person who handles all the visa applications and government relations with other foreign countries, she called and said, "Oh, by the way, do you know your visa for Indonesia has been approved? Are you going to go or are you going to stay?" Are we going to go? It was 2 a.m. when she called. I said, "I can't tell you right now. We're going to have to pray about this and think about this." So we started praying about it. We wrote our 3 main supporting churches and asked them, "What do you think? Should we go to Indonesia? We now have our visa. We've waited 3.5 years to get this stinking visa. Or now we've spent a year in Chinese language studies in Taiwan. Should we stay in Taiwan?" And Sandy and I talked to each other. And we said, if all 3 churches, main supporting churches, say you should go, then we go. If one of them says, "We're not sure, maybe you should stay in Taiwan," then we won't go. Within 2 or 3 weeks, we got mail back. Now, this is the day before internet, so everything was by written mail. So it took a week and a half to get there and a week and a half for their mail to get back. So maybe it was 3 or 4 weeks. We heard back from all 3 churches. They all said, whenever you want to, you can get back into Taiwan. This is your one chance to get into Indonesia. We think God is saying go to Indonesia. And we looked at each other and go, oh my gosh, we're going to Indonesia. It's so clear. We had asked for a clear sign, and God gave us a clear sign. Oh, wait a minute. Dr. Hayden has just figured out what our infertility problem is. Now we're going to have to leave Taiwan, and Dr. Hayden's not going to go to Indonesia with us. What do we do? And so we had in that decision to go to Indonesia to decide, do we put having our family on hold on the back burner, or do we stay in Taiwan against what we thought was clearly the sign of God? And Sandy and I both agreed, no, we're going to Indonesia. It's not that we don't want a family. We want a family, but it's got to be God's way. It's got to be His way. Sorry, this is a tough story. So we go to Indonesia, and 2 months, 3 months after we're in Indonesia, Sandy's getting sick. Something's not right. And so we check with the local doctor. They can't figure out. We find a local Dutch doctor. It turns out she wasn't a doctor, she was a nurse, and she can't figure it out. So I go, Sandy, whatever is going on isn't right. We've got to deal with this. We're going to go to Singapore. Singapore has world-class medical care. So we get to Singapore, and the doctor we see in Singapore has studied in London, in South Africa. Brilliant, brilliant doctor. And he says, well, this will take 5 days to get the results back from all these tests. So we have to stay in Singapore for 5 days. So any of you that know Singapore, you know that wasn't rough. We enjoyed our 5 days in Singapore thoroughly. It was wonderful. At the end of 5 days, we go back to the hospital to get the results, and he goes, Sandy is being admitted into the hospital right now. She has an ectopic pregnancy. We have to do surgery right today. And I'm going, what? Oh my gosh. So Sandy is suddenly having surgery. He does microsurgery. They discover, he takes care of the ectopic pregnancy, which is, a pregnancy outside of it's in the tubes outside of the womb, but not in the ovaries, but in the fallopian tubes. And then we spent about a month after that recovering from, maybe 2 or 3 weeks after that recovering from the surgery. And we're thinking, God, what are you doing? This was her second ectopic pregnancy. She had had one back in 79 when we were preparing to go overseas. And now a second one in Singapore. And we're just, oh Lord, what is happening? So we go back to Indonesia and just go, okay, that's it for family. There are no kids. Because the doctor in Singapore had said, do not get pregnant again. If you get pregnant again, you have a 95% chance of having another ectopic pregnancy. And if you're living in Indonesia, they do not have the medical facilities to deal with discovering it, understanding it. We had to have a test that was called a beta subunit HCG blood test. And they didn't do it anywhere in the country of Indonesia at that time. They probably do now. So we go back to Indonesia. And we see our doctor in Indonesia. And she had just come back from 4 years of studying at Johns Hopkins. And she goes, what are you doing in Indonesia? Go back to America. This is terrible. What kind of organization would send you to Indonesia to work at a time like this? You need to take care of your family issues first. So, do we listen to our doctor? Do we listen to our own hearts? Our mission leader came out and met with us and actually said, if you guys want to go home, the stress level you're facing is so high. Just go home. If you want to stay here in Indonesia, you've been 2 years in Taiwan, you've been 1 year in Indonesia or half year in Indonesia. If you want to stay and finish your term, do another year, year and a half, that's fine too. But if you want to go home, go home. We talked, and we both decided we wanted to stay. We'd studied Chinese for a year. Now we'd studied Indonesian for most of a year. And we hadn't done any work yet in the sense of what we felt we were called to do. And we didn't feel like God was leading us to go home to deal with the health issues. So we stayed another 2 years till 86. In 86, we come back to the States. And for those of you that love history, it's the year that the DC-10 crashed in Chicago. And everybody was killed on board. And it affected my in-laws, Frank and Sally Dennis, who had started the hospital in Taiwan I talked about in the first story. And we're out in New Jersey visiting some relatives, staying with an aunt and uncle. And we want to go out and meet them at the airport, and they're not at the airport. I finally get the agents behind the desk to pass on a message that my in-laws had sent to me. I actually climbed up on the counter and looked over, and I saw a message from my father-in-law, Frank Dennis, to me, sitting on their desk. And they, oh, is that you? Yeah, I said my name already a few times. They gave me the message, and it was that they couldn't fly in because their flight had been canceled. All DC-10s around the world had been grounded after the crash in Chicago. And so we had to go to Baltimore to pick them up 2 days later or something like that. But what was happening during this time is we were getting phone calls. So we're out in New Jersey to pick up my in-laws, but we're getting all these phone calls. One is from the Crisis Prevention Center in Minneapolis. They said, you have just been made an active member on our list. You've been on a waiting list for 2 years, and now you're on the adoption list after 2 years of waiting. And we're going, who put us on that adoption list? Well, they said Sally Dennis, and that's my mother-in-law. She had put us on the adoption list 2 years earlier. Well, we had been in Indonesia trying to decide, do we stay for 2 more years in Indonesia or do we go home? So then we get another phone call, and it's the University of Minnesota saying, you're on our in vitro fertilization program, and you have just come to the top of the list, so we need to see you this week. We go, who put us on that list? Well, Frank Dennis, my father-in-law, put you on that list 2 years ago. So at the time we had the second ectopic pregnancy that was taken care of by surgery in Singapore, my father and mother-in-law had put us on 2 different lists that had about a 2-year waiting time. And we didn't even, I guess maybe we knew about it, but I don't remember thinking about it. It was like that was, in our stress and all the other things, that was the last thing on my mind. It was just hang in there, baby. Just make it through the next few days. And so now we're in New Jersey. We're getting these calls from Crisis Prevention Center, from University of Minnesota. And so we pick up my father and mother-in-law, we go back to Minnesota, and we start the adoption program right away. That was so exciting, let me tell you. And we started all the stuff at the University of Minnesota for in vitro fertilization process. And it's complicated. It's every day at the hospital getting shots. It was every day doing follow-up and checkup. It was painful, frustrating, trying. The adoption was fun. It was basically, what kind of family are you? What kind of situation are you? It was a long shot. The mothers had to choose us. And we lived overseas in Indonesia at the time. And what mother would want their kid to go over to Indonesia with us? But, we thought there's a chance. So we were excited. So it was a very hopeful time. Then the IVF program, June 10th of 1986, they put the fertilized embryos into Sandy. They had 9 that were fertilized. 1 was damaged. Actually, there were 2 or 3 that were damaged. 6. They put 6 fertilized eggs into Sandy. And by the end of the month, they were seeing 3 embryos growing in Sandy. And we're thinking, oh my gosh, we had to call up the adoption agency, and they said, okay, if your IVF is working, then maybe we can't do the adoption. If you only have 1 baby growing, we want you to have a sibling for your baby. But if you have 2 or 3, then we don't. We need those babies, those adopted kids, to be able to go to other families that are desperate for kids and families. So we backed out of the adoption program, and we pursued continuing with the IVF, the pregnancy. And the adoption agency said we can come back anytime if the IVF doesn't work. February 17th of 1987, Davin and Denise were born. They were our twin boy and girl twins that we had been dreaming of for years. If we'd come back in 83, 84, when we had the second ectopic pregnancy surgery, what would God have done? I don't know. God seemed to be telling us to wait, and we waited 2 years. And God gave us Davin and Denise as twins. We think just our willingness to follow God made a difference, that we got God's plan, not my plan, not Sandy's plan. And that's the big thing. Oh, by the way, another crazy God story involved in this. I wasn't there when they were born on February 17th. Sorry, I'm going to cry again. I was in Indonesia. We had both decided our visas to Indonesia, we'd waited 3.5 years to get them. And we needed to keep them. To keep them, I had to go back to Indonesia and spend 3 months in Indonesia. Those were the last 3 months of Sandy's pregnancy, getting our visa. The kids were 6 days old. When I finally got back to the U.S., the Indonesian government wouldn't give us our visa until they heard our kids were born. I had a doctor's letter saying I was desperately needed back for the birth of these twins. It didn't make a dent. The doctor had told Sandy, you know what? Is your husband going to be around as the kids are growing up? And she said, oh yeah, he'll be there. And the doctor said, being there for the birth isn't nearly as important as being there for the rest of their life. So Sandy was okay with that. I get back with our visa in our passports. I meet the kids. I've got a picture of the day I met them at the front door. From the time I arrived in America, Minneapolis, saw the kids, I had 3 months to get them back into Indonesia, or those visas I had fought for were all gone. So when the kids were 2.5 months old, we flew back to Indonesia and continued our work there, got back involved in it. there was a huge change. When I'd been there as a worker, as a missionary, with a wife, but no children, the Indonesians thought, if you don't have children, you're not a real family. You should talk to your father-in-law and tell him to get you a new wife. Take his daughter home and give you a new wife. This was an Indonesian practice or understanding in their culture of a family without children is not a family. And we used to say to them, no, Sandy and I are a family. We are a family. Now I come back with 2 kids. Suddenly the Indonesians are saying, oh my goodness, you have been blessed by God. Will you preach in my church? There were Sundays I was preaching at 5 different churches on a single Sunday because I was blessed by God. No, I have always been blessed by God. I've been blessed with a great wife and great kids. And in some of the hardest times of our life, we've made tough decisions. But God blesses. Now he blesses in his own way. It's never the way we think. So guess what? God is real. And this is another crazy God story. Thank you.